Welcome to the Church Answers podcast. You know what I almost did, Jess? What I almost did is when Alana, our podcast producer, tells me to smile at the end because she said, I don't smile a lot. And you and Sam do smile a lot, and Art does. I don't, you three boys picked up your mom's smile because I'm just this serious guy that never smiles apparently. And so she said, can you please smile at the end of the podcast so we can take some screenshots and maybe use that on social media and other places when we talk about these podcasts. And I almost started just grinning at the beginning, one of my cheesy grins that's really fake. I said, no, that comes at the end. So I'm not going to do that. Just correct me, Jess. Remember, the older I get ready to put the pillowcase on me.
I would rather you not smile than do your fake cheesy smile. I'll take that version.
I know. That's who I am. That's who I am. Thank you for being a part of the Church Answers podcast. Some of you are on YouTube watching this. We thank you and thank you for watching us. Many of you are on an audio podcast, and whatever your app is, hey, give us a rating, a review, subscribe, wherever you are. Get the word out. This is a ministry to our audience, and it's always done so in such a way that our sponsor lets us say a few words about what they do, and then they step aside. So this can be a ministry. And the sponsor is Cheney and Associates, the accounting firm for the church, the accounting firm that's in over 1,100 churches. I've said this in previous podcasts. I chose Cheney in this particular niche to be our partner. We don't just go out and say, here, we need to get sponsors. We try to find these sponsors that are aligned with our values at Church Answers, that love the church. And that's what Cheney does. And that's what Steve Cheney, the founder and CEO, does. So you need to check out Cheney and Associates. You can see it in the show notes, and you can find out all that they do as an accounting firm, as a bookkeeping firm for your church. Okay, Jess, we're going to go on a topic that I think almost every pastor can identify. And we're going to do 3 challenges that pastors face every week. But this first one is the challenge of weekly sermon preparation, just week after week after week. I remember taking a class at seminary. I don't think it was a preaching class, but that is not relevant necessarily. But the professor said, for those of you who are training for ministry, particularly if it's going to involve weekly pulpit ministry, preaching, said, anybody can work hard and do 1 or 2 sermons that are good. But if you have to produce 40 to 50 or more sermons every week, not everybody can do that, and they can't all be good. And so, I heard that and had my doubts about, I think I can do this. But by the time I'd preached my 15th sermon in my church, I knew that I could not produce this home run, if you will, every time. So when I talk to you about challenges, what comes to your mind in weekly sermon preparations? What are some of the challenges that you're facing for the personality of Jess Rayner? Every pastor will have different ones.
Right. I think that's important to know. I'm going to be talking about my perspective because, something I always talk about is to different people in the church, different ministry leaders. Sunday's always coming, and there's always a sermon needing and wanting to be preached, but Sunday's coming, and so it's not like if you don't finish it in time, you can just carry it over the next week. You always have to be prepared. And there is that pressure, that burden, but also that joy that comes with sermon prep, and how pastor sermon prep are completely different. I'm more of a segmented kind of do my sermon prep in chunks. I typically break it in 4 parts, and I do different things along the way. From my research to my outline, to my writing, to my application. I write a outlined manuscript. I know some pastors do a full manuscript, and some pastors like yourself just grab a back of an envelope and write down a few notes and you can go preach. It's not fair. It's not fair that you can do that. Where I spend hours, you spend minutes. So
it's not exactly true. Now, don't tell the audience I only spend minutes on my sermons.
No, I'd say compare where I spend hours, you spend minutes. So where I spend many hours, you spend many minutes. There's some truth to that, but it's all different. I know one pastor I've heard this, is that this pastor sits down Friday morning and writes the sermon until it's complete, and as long as it takes. And so everyone's different. And so my perspective in sermon prep is maybe a little bit different. But it's It's changed over the years. I've been in ministry for over 10 years, been regularly preaching for 8 years. And I would say what's changed for me is the sermon prep has gotten easier, but the burden's gotten heavier.
That's a
And
great statement.
I feel like the skill, the talent, no, talent's not the word. The skill, the ability to actually sermon prep has gotten easier. It's just you talk. It's a weekly grind, and you mention it like producing, for lack of better words. You know my heart in this. Coming up with the
Mhm.
content, delivering that has become easier over the years. But where I found myself now is just feeling the burden of it a lot more. Um, just because the culture's changed rapidly over the past 10 years. I think people are hungry for more. It's a lot. It's a lot. So for me, the challenge is the work, and there's a joy, there's a burden, but it's also connecting it to my church people. And so I have felt that from time to time. So that's kind of my starting point. Is it's a burden, but it's a good burden. But the actual prep has gotten easier.
Well, I've listened to you preach for as long as you have been preaching. I'm usually there on the third or fourth row and listening. I'll go to the 9 a.m. service. So I've watched you develop. I've watched you grow. I've watched the burden increase while the preparation process may be easier. I have also watched the burden increase. So I have a front row view, or if you will, a fourth row view to what is taking place in your own preaching ministry. Now, to be fair, there are times I go to Bradenton and listen to your big brother, Sam, older brother, who is effective just like you in a different way. And I've watched him develop too. Here's one thing that I've noticed about your preaching. You more naturally these days connect it to what is really taking place. You can say culture, the lives of the people. Listening to your sermon is thoroughly expositional, thoroughly exegetical, but more and more, I walk away from your sermons after it's done. Of course, I don't walk away during your sermons. I walk away from your sermons and I say, that's what the Bible says. And then that's what I need to know or do. Is that intentional or is it just part of the growth that you have had as you've preached more?
Yeah. I think that's an area that I have worked at. When I first started preaching, it was more like I want to make sure that I'm communicating God's word accurately. And so I spent a lot of time just on study, and I would communicate that study over the years. I feel like where God's changed my heart is the shepherding aspect of
Mm-hmm.
I do. When I'm sermon prepping, I think about the people in my church. I think about where are they? What are they struggling with? And obviously pastoring, you know the general heartbeat of your church. You know where there are highs and lows. And so how does this particular passage relate and connect to them? Um, that burden, that challenge has grown. And so I feel like there's been seasons that everyone's in, and I think as you're growing into it, there's always going to be a challenge. I think there always should be a challenge with sermon prep too. I think it drives us to dependency on God, and I never want to walk on stage on my own power in an independent way. And so sermon prep to me is also gaining more dependence on God and through that
Mm.
process. And I think what's changed for me over the years too is just the passion. I am more excited to preach. The actual what used to scare me so much was
I
the
remember those
delivery.
days.
Getting on
Yeah, I remember.
stage and speaking. I don't really care to be a public speaker. That's not like my calling. Now, it's less about it's the passion and the sermon prep that makes the delivery a lot easier. And so where God's working on my own heart, and I tell typically what I find too is when there's a message that connects pretty widespread in my church, it's because God did a work in my own heart that week through that message. And so all
That's a
these
good
things,
word.
right? You're going into sermon prep. It's a challenge. You're burdened for your people, but you're also trying to say, God, what is this teaching me? There's heart change that's happening within your own life as a pastor. It's tough. You're walking through some things, but at the same time, it creates passion on Sunday mornings. All this, though, I mean, you talk about repeating this week after week after week. Um, it's a lot. It's a challenge. But I think, especially for you pastors who's listening to this, let me remind you guys. There's a quote by Tozer. It's from The Pursuit of God. I actually think it's like from the intro or prologue of the book. And he said in that book, he says, "My prayer is that my torch will burn just bright enough so that other men can light their torches from it." And so what has been good for me in sermon prep and walking through this challenge is praying that prayer. God, just let my torch just burn just bright enough so that other people can light their torch from it. And so where the challenge exists, the regular sermon prep, my encouragement is pray through it, become more dependent on God, ask God to change your heart, and just let God give you the passion for it.
You know what? I wish I'd almost made this into a 3-part series, but there's some other things I want to talk about. The weekly challenges of pastors too. Like the next episode that we have coming on is going to be about getting volunteers and leading volunteers, and we'll talk about that ongoing challenge. No matter what size church you're in, that is a challenge. When you started the church at Spring Hill, your mother told me, she said, if you want to keep preaching at other churches on the weekend, you do what God leads you to do. I'm going to either be at the church at Spring Hill or West Bradenton Church every week that I can. And so I made the decision, one, that I wanted to be with her and not on the road. And two, the opportunity 40 weeks out of the year to be in your church and the rest of the time to be in Sam's church and to be under the preaching ministry and authority of my sons. That's something that I was not going to pass by. So I've been able to be that 4th row observer for some time, because that's where I sit. 3rd row at Sam's church, 4th row at your church. That has nothing to do with preferential treatment. I just go where your mom goes, and that's where she ends up going. We're going to go to the next episode, and I hope you'll be able to go there. Hey, Jess, let me just mention this one added thing. We're going a little over time, but so forgive me. When we recorded this, it was just a few days after the attempted assassination of former President Trump. And, what do you do in a sermon, when something is so much on the minds of people? Well, you did not put it in the sermon, but you led off with a prayer for our country, or a prayer for you led off with a spiritual emphasis on the culture and what we're going through. Sam led off with a prayer for the country. And so you were able to integrate a cultural event, and the sermon stayed as it was, if I recall.
Actually, I changed it.
Okay.
I changed my whole introduction.
Okay.
Well, I don't think I told you that.
No, I didn't know what it was anyway. Hey, I hope you who are pastors have really taken benefit from this. If you're not a pastor, I hope you understand that this is a part of the life of a pastor, and you need to pray for pastors. Pick up my book, When the People Pray. It's about praying 30 days for your pastor. Pick up that book and get that in your church. And there's a lot there about praying for the preaching of the pastor too. Well, we're going to talk about the issue of volunteers, the weekly things that a pastor has to deal with, the challenges, not negative necessarily, but challenges one way or another. And we'll be talking about that in the episode. As always, thank you, Cheney and Associates. Thank you, Jess, for walking us through this. And we'll see you in the next episode as we continue to talk about the challenges pastors face every week. We'll see you then.